But now, as promised, as Mr. De Hoos just said, it's time to delve into the major challenges facing the world today and the role, in fact, that the European Union needs to play, whether it's in Ukraine or Sudan, living in these uncertain times, and the responsibilities that the European Union has, and the man fronting the European Union on the world stage, and also trying to keep the 27 united, is of course Josep Borrell, whose name was mentioned already. That's the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs, and he's the Vice President as well of the European Commission. And we're delighted to have him here today physically with us in Florence, and I'd like to invite you now up on stage to take a seat beside me, Mr. Borrell.
Morning.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Take a seat. Have a seat. Busy agenda for you. Very busy days for you.
Not today.
Today is a day to reflect. And as we heard this morning, what better place to reflect than in this beautiful room in the Palazzo Vecchio. And Mr. Borrell, it's been 1 year since we sat here together on this same stage in Florence. The world perhaps no safer than it was this time last year. How has the year been for the European Union, and how has the year been for you?
Well, this has been a difficult year, certainly marked by the war. Suddenly the war is at our borders, and we have been very busy trying to support Ukraine. But at the same time, this year we have seen the emergency of China as a big power, an assertive power, and we have seen the fragmentation of the world and many other countries, big countries, populated, growing quickly, and not willing to take side on the Ukrainian war. Yes, voting in the United Nations against the invasion, but politically sending message that shows that there is a feeling of, well, this is not our war. It is going to be very bad for us. Indirectly, high prices of electricity, high prices of energy and food. So I think that for us Europeans, this year has been the year of taking stock of a much complex reality, a fragmented world with a big clash between the two superpowers, US and China. And once again, the real dramatic reality of a war in our borders that cost a lot in terms of money to us and to the Ukrainians in terms of lives.
And do you feel like you've become somewhat a war diplomat? Do you feel like you're prioritizing Ukraine a lot, and sometimes perhaps you might not have time for other issues?
Well, more than diplomacy, well, we are doing diplomacy, but in Ukraine, unhappily, this is not the moment for diplomatic conversations about peace. It's the moment of supporting militarily the war. So I feel as a diplomat, but I feel also as a kind of defense minister of the European Union, because I spend quite an important part of my time talking about arms, ammunition. I never thought that I was going to spend so much time thinking about how many shots of artillery can I provide, can we Europeans provide to the Ukrainians, for example.
Indeed. This time last year we spoke a lot about sanctions. The focus of the EU was sanctions and more sanctions. Now, as you say, it's more focused on defence. Do you feel, when you're meeting behind closed doors with ministers, do you feel like the EU is in war mode?
Well, the war has united us. There is nothing that can unite you more than an enemy, a threat. And the feeling of facing a threat, a real existential threat, has united us more than any speech, any theoretical approach about the need of integration. And it has united also the West, transatlantic relationship has never been stronger like today.
Really?
Yes. Well, with President Biden. Maybe with President Trump, things would have been different. But today, yes, in front of the war in Ukraine, the West, meaning by the West, the transatlantic people, Canada, United Kingdom, US, Europeans, have shown a remarkable unity. And I think that one of the mistakes of Putin was to think that the Europeans would not be united because of the energy dependency, for example, and that the public opinions in Europe would get tired of supporting Ukrainians, and that the US and Europe would have a quarreling about who does what and which share the burden. This is not the case.
And we saw this week President Zelensky of Ukraine traveling to Finland. He was also in the Netherlands. He was in The Hague. Do you think that Europeans are still concerned about the war in Ukraine? Do you think it's still on their minds?
Europeans are a lot of people. It depends.
Voters, let's say voters, or citizens.
Look, it's not the same thing in Florence that in Vilnius. It's not the same thing in the south of Europe that in the Baltics. The Baltics are in the front line, and they have a sincere feeling that if Ukraine falls, they will be the next. For them, it's an existential threat. If you live in Seville, if you live in the other border, the other end of Europe, you don't have the same perception. But if you look at the polls, the great majority of the Europeans agree on supporting Ukraine.
And what about Moldova and Georgia? Are you worried about what could happen there?
Well, you go to Moldova, and we will go to Moldova. Everybody will go to Moldova, because in Moldova it will be taking place the conference on the political community of Europe, whatever it is. No? You have to discover exactly what does it mean. But there will be more than 40 countries meeting in Moldova in some weeks. Moldova is another example. It's still worse than the Baltics. Remember that inside Moldova there are several thousand of Russian troops in Transnistria. Remember that Moldova is critically dependent for electricity and gas from Russia. And from Moldova you hear the guns. So for them, the idea that our security is in danger, their security is in danger, is very much clear.
Joseph Borrell, the big news in Brussels there was the €500 million Ammunition Production Act, just announced by the European Commission, also known as ASAP. How big a deal is this? Do you think it could be a game changer, this plan?
No, a game changer. No, we're talking about a small amount of money. We're talking about 500 million euros. Well, I know that saying that is a small amount of money, 500 million euros, looks a little bit weird, but to the scale of the problem, it's not going to be a game changer. But it's a signal that Europe has to increase its defense capabilities. And the defense capabilities starts by the industrial capabilities. Our industry is at a very, very low level from the point of view of the capacity of production. For a peace situation, that's okay, but for a war, no. So we have to ramp up, we have to increase this capacity. And this Ammunition Act will not really change dramatically the situation, because the European Union budget cannot be used to buy arms. But we're not talking about buying arms, I'm talking about increasing the industrial capacity of the industry of defense, which is something different.
As you say, there are not a lot of money, those 500 million euros. And I understand the plan is to take some money from EU cohesion funds and recovery funds for this fund, money that was actually meant to be used to revamp our economies post-COVID. Do you think people are on board with supporting this investment in arms and they wouldn't worry that we're funding a war instead of a recovery?
You know, everybody prefers butter to the guns. Me, the first. But I think that the people who are in charge, parliamentarians, high-level politicians, at the national level, at the European level, have to send a message. We didn't want this war. We were not looking for it. But the war is a reality, and you have to face it. And everybody wants peace, yes, but the time being, unhappily, Putin is continuing the war, and Ukraine has to defend. And if we don't support Ukraine, Ukraine will fall in a matter of days. So yes, I would prefer to spend this money increasing the well-being of the people, hospitals, schools, the cities, as the mayor is asking for, but we don't have the choice.
We don't have the choice. Any message today for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president? What would be your message to Vladimir Putin?
Well, the only message that the international community and certainly the Europeans are sending is stop this war. Stop this war. Stop bombing Ukraine. Withdraw your troops. I know he's not going to do it. But every time I listen to some world leader saying, I want peace. Yes, okay, if you want peace, push Russia to withdraw. Push Russia to stop the war. Don't tell me stop supporting Ukraine. Because if I stop supporting Ukraine, certainly the war will finish soon. But how? How the war will finish? It doesn't matter? Yes, it matters. It is the most important thing. The war cannot just finish because Ukraine is unable to defend itself and it has to surrender, and the Russian troops will be on the Polish border, and Ukraine will become a second Belarus. Do you want this kind of ending the war? No.
Well, as we're sitting here in Florence, the situation on the ground does not look good. Have you anything to say? What's your assessment on the efforts to find a
Sorry, I
ceasefire?
don't understand.
I was just saying, as we're sitting here today in Florence, the situation on the ground does not look good. Do you see any workable peace plan on the table to stop the war?
The only thing that could be called peace plan is the Zelensky's proposal, because the Chinese peace plan, well, it's not a peace plan. It's a set of wishful consideration, wishful thinkings, but it's not a peace plan. The only one is the one that has been proposed by the Ukrainians, but certainly will not be accepted by the Russians. But let's face the reality, like it or not. The reality is Putin continues saying, I have military objectives, and as far as I don't get these military objectives, I will continue fighting. So the peace plans are good, but you need someone that wants to talk about peace, really. If you found someone who says, I have military objectives, and I will continue bombing, I will continue fighting until I got them, well, what kind of a peace talk do you want to do?
And what about the Chinese head of state, Xi? He had a phone call with President Zelensky. Did you find that phone call reassuring? Do you think they can play a role as a peacemaker?
Since the beginning, I said China has a role to play. And then it was strongly criticized because certainly China is on the side of Russia. But even if there is in the side of Russia, I think China has a role to play. China is a permanent member of the Security Council. China is the one who has the biggest influence in Russia. China has not provided arms to Russia until now. The US were considering this possibility. This has not happened until now. And the fact that President Xi talked with President Zelensky, well, even if he didn't mention war, but they talk, is a good thing. And certainly we are very much interested on not pushing Russia on the side of China too much.
And on China, you had a visit planned to Beijing recently, but you caught COVID.
Yes, I got COVID, and maybe it was not so bad, because Peking was crowded with Europeans. There were so many that maybe it was not the good moment to go. I will go.
It was a blessing in disguise, perhaps. Indeed, it was an interesting time because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was there. He brought along the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. What would your stance be vis-à-vis China? How can you find a stance regarding China that pleases everyone?
Well, yes, Macron was there, President von der Leyen was there, and the Spanish Prime Minister, many others. And it shows something. It shows the role of China, the weight of China in the international arena. It shows that China has influence on Russia. Peking is the place to go, certainly. And I understand that the Europeans were criticized by a certain cacophony, saying different things. Well, in fact, they were not so different. The problem is that in the political speech, people look at a word, a sentence, and they criticize strongly the word and the sentence out of the context. There is not an effort to try to understand what they wanted to say. For example, when President Macron said, and he was strongly criticized for that the European Union may become a vassal of the US. Well, you have to understand what President Macron wanted to say. And I think that he wanted to say that an alliance needs a balance between the members of the alliance. If the alliance is too unbalanced, then there is not an alliance. And we have to take care to keep our capacities, to keep the word strategy, autonomous, looks polemic, but at the end, I think that, yes, we Europeans, we have to have our own way of facing China. On the EU-US-China triangle, we are closer to Washington, certainly. But we have to have our own way, and we are working on that. One of the most important things I am doing now is to prepare a report for the next European Union Council to present our view on China. Because China certainly is a partner, how not? Is a competitor, yes, it's a competitor, but the US is also a competitor, economically speaking. And it's a rival, but what kind of a rival? Is China a threat to the national security of the Europeans, like Russia? In Versailles, the head of state said Russia is a threat to our national security. We have never said that about China. And I think we should not be against the rise of China. China will become a great power, like it or not. The important thing is how China will manage its power.
And what about Europe? Because this event, of course, it's all about Europe, it's all about the European Union as a potential power. And the language of power is your signature phrase. How are we doing? I mean, are we taken seriously on the world stage?
Well, yes, I suppose this sentence will mark my term. Europeans have to learn to use the language of power. But there are many kinds of power. Power is not just military power. It's not just sending troops and occupying territories. But look, now, at that moment, in Port Sudan, in the south of Sudan, there are European warships taking out of Sudan about 200 European citizens. This is a way of showing power.
And on Sudan, what more can the EU do and the international community to stop the conflict there?
It's very little what we can do in Sudan. It's a civil war between the two generals with two armies. Nobody will intervene militarily in Sudan. In Sudan, the only way of acting is trying to get a ceasefire among them through international pressure. And Europeans were one among others. We don't have a surplus of power, but we have certain powers. And the more united we are, the bigger this power will be. And this is, for me, the lesson learned in front of a war, in front of the electricity prices going up. We need more unity. In the world in which we live, we Europeans, we are too small. If we want to survive, we have to be more united. We have to abandon the unanimity vote on foreign policy.
Well, that was my next question, because 9 countries also agree with you, including France and Germany. A letter was sent this week on this very point, putting an end to unanimity. Will that ever fly?
Well, the problem with abandoning unanimity is that it requires unanimity. You need unanimity to abandon unanimity.
Hence my question, will it ever fly? I mean...
Well, I know it's difficult because everybody wants to keep the veto right, because unanimity means each one has the veto right. Unanimity means that if I don't like it, I block it until I get something else. For example, we have been discussing for months about the Cotonou Agreement, and there are blockages for 1 or 2 countries discussing things that has nothing to do with the issue we are discussing, but blocking point A is a way of getting some rewards on point B, which has nothing to do with point A. Well, this is not the way we could work in a world that runs very quickly, where there are big states. China is a state, the US is a state, India is a state. We are not a state. We are a club of states, and we have to have rules that make us able to decide quicker.
Because now, of course, there's talks on another package of sanctions against Russia. There's talk now among the EU member states about more sanctions. But I just wanted to ask you, do you think the focus is more on defence now because there's a feeling that the sanctions were not as effective as they could have been, or they didn't work as fast, perhaps, as they could have?
Sanctions. Look, the other day, it's 3 days ago, it was in Latin America, and I was talking with a president of a great Latin American country. And he told me, look, you are doing with Russia, with your sanctions, the same thing that the Allies in 1919 did with Germany. And I told him, look, I don't understand, which is the comparison. Germany had to face war reparations that certainly were disproportionated and pushed for the Second World War. But our sanctions to Russia has nothing to do with that. We call sanctions, and in fact, the word sanctions doesn't exist on the European Treaty. You go to the European Treaty and you look for sanctions, the word sanctions doesn't exist. It's only restrictive measures. Which are the restrictive measures?
So do they work, restrictive measures?
Yes, they work. Certainly they work.
Okay.
Certainly they work, but they are not instantaneous. Is it like a diet? You want to go in a diet? You're not going to lose 30 kilos in 1 week.
And nobody's going on a diet in Florence. Joseph Borrell, one more question. You have 1 year left. Of course, here we're all talking about the European elections next May or June. We're still waiting for the date to be confirmed. What would you like to achieve in that last year?
A just peace in Ukraine. A just peace in Ukraine. It's the most difficult endeavor. But certainly, this is the thing that matters more today for us. A just peace in Ukraine. And if I could say a second one, is a better understanding with the rest, because there is the West and the rest, a better understanding with them to try to prove that them really matters for us, that we are not only engaged with Ukraine, that we are able to face their complaints, their resentment, and to make them understand that Europe is no longer an imperial or colonial power. It belongs to the past, but is clear a force of peace in order to face the global challenges. And the global challenges is not only climate, it's the debt and its development. To work more with them, because we still have a too much Eurocentric approach to the rest of the world.
Okay. Joseph Borrell, thank you so much for speaking to us here at the State of the Union in Florence. A round of applause for the High Representative.
Thank you. It's very moving to see at a fantastic place.
Our clock is showing 1 minute. I don't know if there's one question from the audience, perhaps, before you take your seat.
Questions from the audience. This is the difficult moment.
Okay. Well then, thank you so much for speaking to me.
You.
Take care. Enjoy your day in Florence.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. The acoustics are not great, I know.
Thank you.
Take care.